terrifying true scary stories. In the heart of a dense Canadian forest, where the trees seemed to touch the sky and the darkness clung to every branch, for souls ventured into the unknown. They were drawn by the thrill of an unusual meeting, something that promised excitement but carried an unspoken edge of danger. Two young men, full of bravado yet unaware of the true terror that lurked beyond the shadows. Two women, seasoned by life's trials, yet still unprepared for what would unfold. The night was eerily still, the only sound being the distant howl of a creature unseen. What started as a simple gathering in the woods would soon become a fight for survival. The forest, ancient and unforgiving, held secrets that were better left undisturbed. As the group settled around the flickering flames of their campfire, they had no idea that the real horror was just beginning. Something was watching them, something far beyond their wildest nightmares. And in that silence, with the crackling fire as their only comfort, a chilling realization would soon creep into their bones, leaving them trapped in a nightmare they could not escape. But what was it? What force of terror had set its sights on these unsuspecting souls? The answer lay in the darkness, waiting to be unleashed. As the night deepened, the group found themselves engulfed in an eerie silence that weighed heavy on their minds. The once inviting warmth of the campfire now felt like a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of a branch, seemed to echo with a sense of impending doom. They laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing fear that gripped their hearts, but the tension was undeniable. The two young men, Daniel and Lucas, tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but their voices betrayed a hint of anxiety. The women, Mara and Claire, exchanged uneasy glances, their instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. It was Mara who first noticed the unnatural stillness in the air. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Claire nodded, her eyes scanning the shadows, searching for something that shouldn't be there. Without warning, a bone-chilling scream pierced the night, freezing them in their tracks. It wasn't human, yet it wasn't entirely animal either. The sound seemed to come from all directions, as if the forest itself was alive with malevolent intent. Daniel jumped to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, but his words were swallowed by the dense trees that surrounded them. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of their firelight, something that radiated pure, unadulterated horror. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, each one punctuated by the deafening silence that followed the scream. And then, the shadows began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they closed in on the group, their shapes twisting and contorting into forms that defied logic. Mara's heart raced as she saw the flicker of glowing eyes in the darkness, eyes that seemed to bore into her soul, stripping away her courage and replacing it with sheer terror. "We need to stick together," she said, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. But it was too late. The forest had them now, and it wasn't about to let them go. The ground beneath them began to tremble, as if the earth itself was preparing to swallow them whole. Shadows reached out like claws, grasping at their feet, pulling them deeper into the nightmare. Daniel's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in total darkness. And in that darkness, they could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something evil, something that fed on fear. The terror was palpable, a living entity that wrapped itself around their minds, squeezing until rational thought was impossible. They were trapped, lost in a forest that had become a living nightmare, with no escape in sight. The realization hit them all at once: this was no ordinary encounter. They had stumbled upon something far worse than any ghost story or urban legend. This was real. And it was hungry. As the group huddled together, the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them, suffocating and relentless. Their senses were heightened, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. They could feel the presence lurking just out of sight, a malevolent force that thrived on their growing fear. The once confident Daniel was now trembling, his bravado shattered as the reality of their situation sank in. Lucas, normally the voice of reason, was now panicking, his eyes darting around wildly as he tried to make sense of the horrors unfolding before them. "We can't stay here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to move, now." but the forest had other plans. The ground beneath them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, making every step feel like a struggle against an unseen force. Mara, her instincts sharpened by years of surviving life's hardships, took the lead. "Stay close," she urged, her voice steady despite the terror gnawing at her insides. She knew they had to keep moving, but every direction felt like it led deeper into the abyss. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, ready to drag them into the unknown. Claire, the most experienced of the group, felt a cold dread settle in her chest. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This was primal, a fear that bypassed logic and went straight to the core of her being. She could see the fear reflected in the eyes of her companions, each one of them struggling to hold on to the last shreds of sanity. "We need to find a way out," she said, trying to inject some hope into their dire situation. But even as she spoke, she knew it was a lie. The forest wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it was hungry. The trees whispered secrets in a language long forgotten, the wind carried the echoes of 1,000 lost souls, and the shadows danced with a life of their own. The group moved as one, their footsteps synchronized by fear, but it wasn't long before the forest began to play its cruel tricks. The path they thought they were following twisted and turned, leading them in circles, deeper into the heart of the nightmare. Daniel stumbled, his foot catching on something unseen. As he looked down, his blood ran cold. A hand, pale and skeletal, jutted out from the ground, clutching at the earth as if trying to escape from the grave. "We need to go back," he screamed, but it was too late. The forest had them, and it wasn't about to let them go. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, and the temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the icy air. The shadows around them began to take shape, forming grotesque figures, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths twisted into silent screams. It was as if the forest was showing them the fate that awaited them, an eternity trapped in this cursed place, their souls lost to the darkness. Mara felt a wave of despair wash over her. They were being hunted, but by what? She could sense it now, the malevolent force that had been stalking them since they first entered the forest. It was ancient, powerful, and it was feeding off their fear. The more terrified they became, the stronger it grew. And now, it was ready to strike. The shadows lunged at them, cold hands grasping at their limbs, pulling them apart. The forest came alive with the sounds of their screams, each one a testament to the horror they were experiencing. Mara fought against the shadows, her mind racing for a way out, but deep down she knew they were doomed. The forest had claimed them, and there was no escape. The once vibrant campfire was now a smoldering heap, its embers barely clinging to life as the oppressive darkness threatened to snuff out what little light remained. The group was scattered, each person lost in their own corner of the nightmare, separated by the forest's cruel design. Mara, battered and exhausted, crawled through the underbrush, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the others, faint echoes of their desperate cries, but they seemed impossibly far away. The forest was no longer just a setting, it had become a living entity, a monstrous force that seemed to breathe with malevolent intent. The air was thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the shadows danced with a life of their own, twisting into grotesque forms that defied comprehension. Mara's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the horrors that had befallen them, but every thought was clouded by the suffocating fear that gripped her. In the distance, she saw a figure, a woman, her clothes torn and bloodied, staggering through the trees. It was Claire. Mara called out to her, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She pushed herself to her feet and stumbled towards Claire, her heart pounding in her chest. As she drew closer, she saw the terror in Claire's eyes, a terror that mirrored her own. "We have to get out of here," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. But the words held no comfort, they both knew the truth. There was no escape. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the forest, a sound so primal and filled with rage that it seemed to come from the very earth itself. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the trees groaned as if in pain. Mara looked up and saw it, a massive shadow, darker than the blackest night, looming over them. It was formless, a void that absorbed all light, all hope. The presence they had felt all night had finally revealed itself, and it was more terrifying than anything they could have imagined. Claire screamed, a sound of pure, unfiltered horror, and began to run. But there was nowhere to go. The shadow moved with unnatural speed, engulfing everything in its path. Mara stood frozen, her body refusing to obey her desperate mind. She watched as the shadow consumed Claire, her screams cutting off abruptly as the darkness swallowed her whole. And then, it turned its attention to Mara. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Mara's life flashed before her eyes, memories of happier times, of laughter and love, now tainted by the terror of this night. She knew that this was the end. The forest had claimed her, just as it had claimed countless others before her. There was no escaping the horror that awaited her in the darkness. As the shadow closed in, Mara felt a cold hand grasp her shoulder, pulling her back into the depths of the forest. The ground opened up beneath her, a yawning chasm filled with the stench of death and decay. She was falling, tumbling into the abyss, her screams echoing through the void. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the twisted, grinning faces of the damned, their eyes filled with eternal torment. And then, there was nothing. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The campfire, long extinguished, left no trace of the horrors that had occurred that night. The forest had claimed its victims, and the darkness, ever hungry, awaited the next unfortunate souls to wander into its depths. Horrifying moments at the last day of school. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, a day when the pressures of exams and the anxieties of high school were finally behind them. The seniors of Liberty High in Kansas had been waiting for this day, the last day of school, when they would step out of the confines of the classroom and into the world beyond. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the empty halls, something sinister began to stir within the school's old brick walls. The students gathered in the gymnasium, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings as they reminisced about their years together. But beneath the surface, an uneasy tension hung in the air, unnoticed by most. The school, with its history steeped in tragedy, had always been a place of whispered rumors and unexplained occurrences. And on this final day, those dark secrets were about to be revealed. As the last bell rang, signaling the end of an era, the doors of Liberty High creaked shut, locking the students inside. What started as a harmless senior prank would soon turn into a night of unspeakable horror. Trapped within the school's labyrinthine corridors, the students would come face to face with a terror they could never have imagined. And as the darkness closed in, the halls of Liberty High would become a nightmare from which there was no escape. The gymnasium, once filled with the joyous sounds of celebration, had fallen eerily silent. The students, now scattered throughout the school, began to sense that something was wrong. The lights flickered, casting unsettling shadows on the walls, and the air grew cold, a chill that seeped into their bones. They laughed it off at first, blaming the old building or a power surge, but the unease was undeniable. A group of friends, Jake, Emily, Sarah, and Ryan, decided to explore the school one last time before leaving it behind forever. They wandered through the familiar hallways, now filled with an unfamiliar sense of dread. The once comforting sounds of lockers slamming and teachers' voices were replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. As they turned a corner, they noticed something strange, a locker door slightly ajar, something that should have been impossible since the school was officially closed for the summer. Jake, always the bravest of the group, approached it with a smirk. "Probably just someone's forgotten junk," he muttered, reaching out to open it. But as the door swung open, a wave of cold air rushed out, and with it, a faint, sickly sweet odor that made them all gag. Inside the locker was not forgotten school supplies, but something far more disturbing. A tattered, blood-stained uniform hung limply, its fabric torn and frayed as if it had been through a violent struggle. The friends exchanged nervous glances, the reality of their situation beginning to sink in. Emily's voice trembled as she spoke. "This isn't funny, Jake. Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the hallway lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their phones, the small beams of light barely penetrating the thick blackness that surrounded them. "We need to find the others," Ryan said, his voice shaking. But the school, once so familiar, now felt like a maze, its corridors stretching into the unknown. As they moved deeper into the school, strange things began to happen. The walls seemed to close in on them, the floor creaked underfoot as if something was moving beneath it, and the air grew thicker, suffocating. Faint whispers echoed through the halls, unintelligible but filled with a malice that sent shivers down their spines. Sarah clutched Jake's arm, her fear palpable. "This isn't real, right?" "It's just a prank," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as the others. But deep down, they all knew that something had gone horribly wrong. The school, once a place of learning and laughter, had transformed into a twisted nightmare. And the horrors that lurked within were just beginning to reveal themselves. As they reached the main stairwell, they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness below. It was unlike anything they had ever heard, a sound that sent a wave of terror crashing over them. Jake, his bravado finally cracking, whispered, "We have to get out of here. Now." But the exit, which should have been just a few steps away, seemed impossibly far. And with every second that passed, the darkness closed in tighter, as if the school itself was alive, determined to keep them trapped inside. The terror was building, and they were only beginning to understand the true horror that awaited them on this last day of school. The growl reverberated through the stairwell, freezing the group in place. Their breaths quickened, each one a puff of cold air in the suddenly frigid atmosphere. Jake tightened his grip on the small flashlight, its beam flickering uncertainly, as if the light itself was afraid of the darkness that surrounded them. "We have to stay together," he said, trying to steady his voice, but the fear was unmistakable. They descended the stairs cautiously, the steps creaking underfoot like a warning. The growling had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was even more unsettling. It was as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something they couldn't see, but could feel watching them. The deeper they went, the more the school seemed to change, its familiar hallways warping into something out of a nightmare. The group reached the basement level, a place they had rarely ventured during their time at Liberty High. The walls were damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and foul. The floor was slick, making each step treacherous. Ryan shone his flashlight around, revealing old, forgotten equipment covered in dust and cobwebs. "This place is like a tomb," he muttered, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. As they moved forward, the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Emily let out a small yelp as she thought she saw a figure lurking in the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there. "This can't be happening," she whispered, but the terror in her voice betrayed her disbelief. The group stumbled upon an old storage room, its door slightly ajar. They hesitated, but the thought of staying out in the open was even more terrifying. Jake pushed the door open, and they filed in, huddling together as they tried to catch their breath. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture and broken desks, but it felt safer than the dark corridors outside. But safety was an illusion. As they sat in the cramped space, trying to make sense of what was happening, the temperature dropped even further. Their breath formed small clouds in the icy air, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Jake's flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, they heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, coming from all around them. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices speaking in a language they couldn't understand. The sound filled the room, pressing in on them from all sides. Panic set in as the realization hit them, they were not alone. Something was in the room with them, something that had been there all along, waiting for them to let their guard down. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound echoing in the confined space. The room was plunged into complete darkness as Jake's flashlight finally gave out. The whispers turned into a cacophony of voices, overlapping and intertwining, until they became a single, blood-curdling scream. The walls shook, the floor seemed to buckle beneath them, and the terror was overwhelming. Ryan fumbled for the door, his hands shaking, but it wouldn't budge. "We have to get out," he yelled, but the words were drowned out by the screams that filled the air. The room seemed to close in on them, the darkness becoming a tangible force, suffocating and relentless. Sarah felt something brush against her leg, cold and clammy, and she recoiled in horror, but there was nowhere to go. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent once more, the oppressive darkness still as death. But the terror remained, a lingering presence that refused to leave. They were trapped, and whatever was haunting them was far from done. The last day of school had become a nightmare, and the worst was yet to come. The silence in the room was deafening, the kind that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat the only sound you can hear. The group stood frozen, too terrified to move, too scared to speak. The darkness was absolute, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped, trapping them in an endless moment of terror. But then, faintly at first, they heard it, the distant tolling of a bell. It echoed through the school, a haunting sound that grew louder with each chime. Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "The bell, it's not supposed to ring again," he whispered, the words barely escaping his dry throat. The others exchanged nervous glances, the fear in their eyes unmistakable. They all knew what it meant, the final bell was never supposed to ring, not after the last day of school. Suddenly, the door to the storage room creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway beyond. The flickering light cast long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out towards them, beckoning them forward. "We have to leave now," Sarah said, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. But as they stepped into the hallway, they realized that the school had changed once more. The walls were lined with old, decrepit lockers, their doors hanging ajar as if someone had been rifling through them in a hurry. The floor was slick with something dark and viscous, a foul stench permeating the air. Ryan took the lead, his steps cautious as he guided the group through the twisted corridors. The bell continued to toll, each chime sending a shiver down their spines. They followed the sound, hoping against hope that it would lead them to an exit, to freedom. But with each step, the sense of dread grew stronger, the realization that they were being led deeper into the heart of the school's darkness. They turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a figure, barely visible in the flickering light. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, but there was no mistaking the malevolent energy that radiated from it. The figure seemed to glide towards them, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear that rolled off them in waves. Jake tried to muster the courage to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Emily clung to his arm, her nails digging into his skin as she trembled uncontrollably. We need to go," Ryan stammered, but his feet refused to move. The figure drew closer, its features becoming clearer, the hollow eyes, the twisted grin, the pale, almost translucent skin. It was as if the very essence of the school's darkest secrets had taken form, a manifestation of every ghost story, every whispered rumor that had ever circulated through Liberty High. And then it spoke. The voice was a low, guttural rasp, filled with malice and ancient fury. "You don't belong here," it hissed, the words slithering through the air like a cold wind. "This place, it's mine." The figure raised a hand, long, bony fingers pointing directly at them. The air around them grew thick, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in. Panic took over. Jake turned and ran, pulling Emily along with him. The others followed, their footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow hallway. The figure's laughter followed them, a sound so chilling it seemed to freeze the blood in their veins. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the exit nowhere in sight. Desperation clawed at their minds as they realized they were trapped, running in circles within the school's nightmarish labyrinth. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, they burst through a set of double doors and found themselves in the main foyer. The night sky was visible through the glass doors, a sight so beautiful it nearly brought tears to their eyes. But as they rushed towards freedom, the final bell tolled once more, a deep, resonant sound that shook the very foundations of the school. The doors swung open, and they spilled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The figure was nowhere to be seen, the school behind them silent and still. They had escaped, but the horror of that night would stay with them forever. The last day of school had become a nightmare, and though they had survived, They knew the darkness of Liberty High would never truly let them go. Rock band on the road of horror. As the neon lights of the city faded into the distance, the van sped down the dark highway with the last echoes of their raucous concert still ringing in their ears. The 5 members of the band were drenched in sweat and adrenaline as they laughed and joked while recounting the night's high-energy performance. This was their life, loud, fast, and fearless. They lived for the chaos and thrived on the music. But as the city lights disappeared and the road ahead stretched into the pitch-black night, an uneasy silence settled over them that none of them could quite shake. Jake, the lead singer, was the first to notice the change. The road was usually bustling with late-night traffic, but now it was eerily empty. The only sound was the steady hum of the van's engine. "Is it just me, or does this place feel off?" he muttered, glancing out the window at the inky darkness that seemed to press in on all sides. The others shrugged it off, blaming it on exhaustion after the show, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. As they continued down the highway, the landscape around them began to change in subtle and unsettling ways. The trees lining the road twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers casting long and twisted shadows across the pavement. The moon, once full and bright, now seemed distant and cold, its light barely piercing the gloom. The radio, which had been blaring classic rock tunes moments before, crackled and hissed with static, then cut out entirely as the van entered a stretch of road that none of them recognized. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated only by the van's headlights. Tall and gaunt, it seemed almost otherworldly, its features obscured by shadows. The van screeched to a halt as the tires skidded on the asphalt. The band members stared in stunned silence. What they had dismissed as nerves was now a full-blown sense of dread, and as the figure slowly turned its head towards them, a chill ran down their spines. Something was very wrong, and they were about to discover just how horrifying this road truly was. The van sat idling on the deserted road, the headlights casting an eerie glow on the figure standing just a few feet away. No one dared to speak, their breaths held in collective anticipation as the figure slowly began to move. It took a step forward, its movements unnaturally slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring each moment. The tension in the van was palpable, the band members frozen in place, unable to tear their eyes away from the scene unfolding before them. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with the effort to stay calm. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a face that was almost human, but not quite. The skin was pale and translucent, stretched tight over sharp, angular bones, and the eyes, those eyes, were black as coal, void of any emotion or life. A shiver ran through the van as they realized this was no ordinary person standing before them. Emily, the bassist, finally broke the silence. "We need to go, Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But Jake couldn't move, his body locked in place by a fear that was almost paralyzing. The figure took another step closer, and then another, until it was just inches from the van's hood. The air grew thick with a sense of impending doom, and a cold sweat broke out across Jake's brow. Suddenly, the figure's hand shot out, slamming against the van's hood with a force that shook the entire vehicle. The band members jumped in their seats, a collective gasp escaping their lips. The figure leaned in, its face inches from the windshield, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The world around them was silent, the only sound the frantic beating of their hearts. Then, without warning, the figure let out a guttural scream that reverberated through the van, shattering the stillness of the night. The sound was like nothing they had ever heard before, raw, primal, and filled with a rage that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. Jake snapped out of his trance, his instincts kicking in as he slammed his foot on the gas. The van lurched forward, its tires squealing as they sped away from the horrifying figure. But as they drove into the darkness, the sense of dread didn't fade. The figure was gone, but the terror it left behind clung to them like a shadow. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, the trees on either side seeming to close in, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing mile. Something was following them, something that wasn't going to let them go easily. The van hurtled down the highway, the engine roaring as Jake pushed it to its limits. The fear that had gripped them back on the road now turned into a desperate need to escape. But no matter how fast they drove, the sense of being followed never wavered. It was as if the darkness itself was chasing them, closing in with every turn of the wheel. Emily kept glancing out the back window, her breath hitching every time she thought she saw a shadow move. Ryan, the drummer, sat in the passenger seat, eyes glued to the road ahead. The headlights barely caught through the oppressive blackness, revealing only fleeting glimpses of twisted trees and empty road. But something was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Ryan could feel it, a cold presence that sent chills down his spine. "We can't keep driving like this forever," he muttered, his voice tight with anxiety. But Jake's foot stayed firmly on the gas pedal. He knew stopping was not an option. Then, as if in response to Ryan's words, the van's headlights flickered and dimmed. The dashboard lights followed suit, casting the interior into near-total darkness. Panic surged through the van as the engine sputtered, the power draining as quickly as their hope. "What the hell is happening?" Jake shouted, his voice cracking as he wrestled with the steering wheel, trying to keep the van on the road. The van slowed to a crawl, the engine dying with a final, pitiful cough. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breaths of the band members. They sat in the dark, the van now a powerless hunk of metal in the middle of nowhere. The reality of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket, stranded, in the dead of night, with something unexplainable hunting them. Before anyone could react, the radio crackled to life, blaring static that filled the van with an unsettling hum. Then, beneath the static, they heard it, a faint, distorted voice, speaking words that sent a jolt of terror through their hearts. It was as if the voice was speaking directly to them, whispering in a language they couldn't understand but felt in their bones. Emily clutched her chest, her heart racing as the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was all they could hear. Without warning, the van's headlights blazed back on, illuminating the road ahead. But what they saw made their blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road was the figure, the same one they had left behind. It stood motionless, its black eyes locked onto them, its presence more menacing than before. The voice on the radio faded into a low growl, echoing in the back of their minds. Jake reached for the ignition, his hands trembling, but the key wouldn't turn. The van was dead, and they were trapped. The figure began to move towards them, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. The band members huddled together, their fear palpable as the figure drew nearer. This time, there would be no escape. The figure moved closer, each step measured and deliberate, as if savoring the fear that radiated from the van. Inside, the band members were paralyzed with terror, their breaths shallow and quick. The headlights illuminated the figure's ghastly face, pale, almost ghostly, with those void-like eyes that seemed to pierce through their souls. The van, their once safe haven, now felt like a coffin, sealing them in with their doom. Jake's hands shook as he frantically tried to start the van, but the engine remained silent, refusing to roar to life. The figure was now just feet away, its presence more overwhelming than ever. The air inside the van grew thick and cold, every breath a struggle as the weight of dread bore down on them. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, muttering a desperate prayer under her breath, while Ryan gripped the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, as the figure reached the front of the van, it suddenly vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. For a brief, fleeting moment, they felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was quickly shattered as the van's windows fogged up, and words began to appear, written from the outside by an unseen hand. The letters formed slowly, deliberately, each one sending a new wave of terror through their hearts. The message read, "You can't run from me." Panic erupted inside the van. They pounded on the doors, tried to break the windows, but the van seemed to have a life of its own, trapping them inside. The radio crackled again, this time emitting a low, rumbling laugh that filled the van with a sound so unnatural it made their skin crawl. The headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that twisted and turned, distorting reality itself. And then, the van's engine roared to life on its own. The vehicle lurched forward, the tires screeching as it sped down the road at a breakneck speed. But none of them were driving. the van was under the control of something else, something that wasn't human. The road ahead was a blur, the trees on either side whipping by as they were hurtled towards some unknown destination. Jake tried to steer, but the wheel wouldn't budge, locked in place by an unseen force. The radio blared a cacophony of sounds, screams, growls, and distorted music that made their heads spin. The van careened down the highway, faster and faster, until it felt like they were on the verge of losing control completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the van skidded to a stop, throwing them forward in their seats. They found themselves in front of an old, decrepit house, its windows dark and its doors slightly ajar. The van's engine died again, plunging them into silence. The figure stood at the doorway, beckoning them inside. There was no escape, no way out. The road had led them here, to this place, where their final encore awaited. One by one, they stepped out of the van, their hearts pounding as they approached the house. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from the van's headlights. As they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, sealing their fate. The last thing they heard was the sound of their own screams, echoing through the night, as the house claimed them forever. Nightmare in the forest. The dense canopy of the ancient forest loomed above, blocking out the sun and casting the path ahead in deep, foreboding shadows. Oliver and Sophie, a young English couple eager for adventure, had heard whispers of this place, Aokigahara, the Sea of Trees, a forest in Japan known for its haunting beauty and terrifying legends. They had read about the eerie quiet, the dense undergrowth that twisted and turned like a living maze, and the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. But curiosity had won out over caution, and now, as they stood at the entrance, the weight of the forest's reputation settled over them like a heavy shroud. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze stirred the trees. The couple exchanged a glance, their earlier excitement now tinged with unease. "We'll just explore a little," Oliver said, trying to keep his voice light, but even he couldn't ignore the chill that ran down his spine. Sophie nodded, but her grip on his hand tightened as they stepped forward into the forest's dark embrace. The further they walked, the thicker the trees became, their gnarled roots twisting across the ground like the fingers of the dead. The path, once clear, quickly disappeared, leaving them to navigate by instinct alone. The forest seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder with each step. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound amplified in the stillness. They had come seeking adventure, but what they found was something far more sinister. As they ventured deeper, a sense of dread began to build, an almost tangible force that weighed heavily on their minds. The trees whispered in a language they couldn't understand, the wind carrying voices that seemed to call out to them from the darkness. Oliver tried to shake off the feeling, but the further they went, the more he felt as if they were being watched. And not by anything human. Suddenly, the path opened up into a small clearing, and there, in the center, stood an old, decrepit shrine. It was covered in moss, the wood rotting and crumbling with age, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Sophie shivered, her eyes locked on the shrine as a sense of foreboding washed over her. "I don't like this place," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Oliver nodded, but before he could suggest they turn back, the forest around them came alive with a low, mournful wail. The spirits of Aokigahara had sensed their presence, and they were far from welcoming. The mournful wail echoed through the forest, sending a shiver down Sophie's spine. The eerie sound seemed to come from all directions at once, enveloping them in a chilling embrace. Oliver felt his pulse quicken, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But something kept him rooted to the spot, a mix of curiosity and a deep-seated fear that if they moved, whatever was watching them would strike. Sophie's grip on Oliver's hand tightened, her nails digging into his skin as the wail slowly faded into an oppressive silence. They exchanged a glance, their earlier bravado now completely stripped away. "I think we should go back," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with barely contained fear. Oliver nodded, but as they turned to retrace their steps, the path they had taken seemed to have vanished, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. Panic began to set in as they realized they were lost, the familiar landmarks now twisted and distorted, as if the forest itself was shifting around them. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Every direction looked the same, and with each passing moment, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Suddenly, Sophie stumbled, catching her foot on something buried beneath the fallen leaves. She gasped as she realized what it was, a small, weathered doll, its eyes missing, and its body covered in dirt and grime. It looked as if it had been there for decades, forgotten by time, yet there was something disturbingly fresh about it. Oliver helped her to her feet, but the sight of the doll sent a fresh wave of terror through them both. As they continued to search for the path, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. They were voices, speaking in hushed tones, in a language neither of them understood. The words carried a weight, a sense of sorrow and longing that seemed to seep into their very souls. Oliver's heart raced as he realized these were the voices of the lost, the spirits of those who had wandered into the forest and never returned. Sophie's breath hitched as she felt a cold hand brush against her arm, but when she turned, there was nothing there. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, pulling them deeper into the forest's embrace. They were no longer alone. The spirits of Aokigahara had awoken, and they were not pleased with the intruders who had dared to disturb their eternal rest. Oliver and Sophie tried to run, but the forest seemed to conspire against them, the roots tangling around their feet, the branches clawing at their clothes. The whispers became a cacophony of voices, each one filled with a mix of anger, despair, and a longing for something they could never attain. The couple was trapped, lost in a forest that was far more alive, and far more deadly, than they had ever imagined. The dense forest pressed in around them, the whispers now a constant, unnerving presence that gnawed at their sanity. Oliver and Sophie stumbled through the underbrush, every step a struggle as the forest seemed to resist their attempts to escape. The trees twisted and loomed like dark, towering figures, their branches clawing at the couple as they pushed forward in a blind panic. The cold hand of fear gripped them both, and the realization that they were truly lost in this nightmare began to settle in. Oliver tried to steady his breath, his mind racing for a solution. But the more they fought to find a way out, the more disoriented they became. The forest was alive, shifting and twisting around them, each path leading deeper into the darkness. Sophie's voice cracked as she called out, her words barely audible over the constant murmuring of the spirits. "Oliver, where are we going?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, because he didn't know. The certainty that had driven them into the forest was now replaced by sheer terror. As they continued to push forward, they found themselves at the edge of a small, stagnant pond. The water was dark and still, a mirror reflecting the twisted branches above. Sophie hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but a strange compulsion drew her closer. As she approached the edge, the surface of the water began to ripple, disturbed by something beneath. A face appeared in the reflection, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. It was not her reflection. Sophie recoiled, stumbling backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Oliver grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the pond as the face in the water faded back into the depths. But the encounter had shaken them both, their fear now mingled with a sense of helplessness. The spirits of Aokigahara were not merely watching, they were toying with them, pulling them deeper into their world, where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. As they backed away from the pond, the ground beneath them shifted, and suddenly, the earth gave way, sending them tumbling into a hidden pit. They landed hard on the cold, damp ground, the wind knocked out of them. The walls of the pit were lined with ancient roots, twisted and gnarled, like the fingers of the dead reaching up from the earth. As they scrambled to their feet, they realized they were not alone. In the dim light, they could see them, figures, half-formed, their bodies barely more than shadows, but their eyes were filled with a hunger that sent chills through their bones. The spirits of the forest had trapped them, and there was no way out. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, the voices now clear and demanding. They could feel the spirits closing in, their presence heavy in the air, pressing down on them with a force that made it hard to breathe. Sophie clung to Oliver, her mind racing as she searched for some way to escape the nightmare they had stumbled into. But the pit was deep, the walls too slick to climb, and the spirits were getting closer. Oliver's heart raced as he realized they were running out of time. The spirits were not going to let them leave. They had come seeking adventure, but they had found something far more terrifying, a place where the dead ruled, and the living were merely playthings in their twisted game. The forest had them now, and it wasn't about to let them go. The pit's cold, damp walls closed in around Oliver and Sophie, the shadows growing longer and darker as the spirits pressed closer. Their breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick with the scent of decay and the weight of ancient despair. Sophie's grip on Oliver's arm tightened as they backed up against the wall, the ghostly figures advancing slowly, their hollow eyes fixed on the living intruders. The whispers had grown into a cacophony, the voices now filled with a hunger that sent shivers down their spines. Oliver's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out, but there was none. The pit was too deep, and the spirits had them trapped. Every time they moved, the shadows seemed to shift, the walls of the pit closing in, sealing their fate. Sophie tried to speak, to say something that might break the spell, but her voice was lost in the roar of the spirits' whispers, her words swallowed by the darkness. Then, as if sensing their hopelessness, the spirits began to reach out, their ghostly hands brushing against Oliver and Sophie's skin with an icy touch that froze them in place. The sensation was like nothing they had ever felt before, cold, yet burning, like the grip of death itself. Sophie's breath hitched as one of the spirit's hands slid over her shoulder, its touch leaving a trail of frost in its wake. Oliver tried to pull her closer, to protect her from the encroaching darkness, but the spirits were relentless, their grip tightening as they closed in. In that moment, Oliver understood. This forest was not just a place, it was a realm of the lost, a world where the living did not belong. The spirits of Aokigahara were not merely haunting the forest, they were part of it, bound to the land by a force that was older and more powerful than anything Oliver could comprehend. And now, they had claimed him and Sophie as their own. As the spirits closed in, their voices reached a fever pitch, a chorus of sorrow and longing that echoed through the pit and into the very core of their beings. The world around them began to blur, the edges of reality fading as the spirits pulled them deeper into their embrace. Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she clung to Oliver, her fear giving way to a profound sense of loss. They had come so far, only to be consumed by the very darkness they had sought to explore. Oliver felt the cold seeping into his bones, the warmth of life slipping away as the spirit's touch grew more insistent. He could feel them pulling him down, their voices now a part of him, filling his mind with their sorrow, their despair. The pit seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in as the darkness swallowed them whole. And then, in the final moments, as the last vestiges of light faded, Oliver and Sophie realized they were no longer themselves. They had become part of the forest, their souls entwined with the spirits of Aokigahara, forever lost in the sea of trees. The forest, silent once more, reclaimed its hold over the land, the whispers fading into the wind as the pit closed up, leaving no trace of the couple who had dared to venture into its depths. Aokigahara stood still, ancient and unyielding, a place where the lost were never found, and where the living did not escape. The nightmare in the forest had claimed its latest victims, and the spirits waited patiently for the next ones to come. Prepare for a journey into darkness with 4 terrifying tales that explore the depths of human fear. From the haunted halls of Liberty High on its last day, to a rock band's horrifying encounter on a desolate road, to the chilling final moments in a dense Canadian forest, and finally, the sinister secrets of Japan's Aokigahara forest. Each story delves into a world where nightmares come alive, the spirits of the lost seek vengeance, and the line between the living and the dead is razor thin. Will you dare to uncover the truth behind the terror? Do you hear the whispers?